Hey everyone, welcome back. In this class, we're going to look at how we can implement a continuous delivery process for the Oracle changes that we make to our Oracle schemas and databases. In previous videos, we looked at how we could source control our database changes and also run automated builds against those changes through a continuous integration process to make sure that all of our changes are valid and that we haven't introduced any invalid objects or any bad practices in terms of coding into our schema. So in this session, I'd like to extend that and talk about how we can take those successful builds and deploy those out to target environments. So let's get started. So here I have, just to quickly go back to what we covered in our previous video. So we made a couple of changes to our schema. We committed them into our source control repository. So if you remember, we made a change to procedure and a table. And once we checked those into source control, the next thing we did was to run a build to make sure that those changes are valid. So we went ahead and ran our build in Jenkins to make sure that all of our changes are valid. And as you can see here, our build was successful. So what that means is we were able to build the database schema from scratch, make sure all the objects can be created successfully. We ran the find invalid objects to make sure that there are no invalid objects in our database. And we also ran some static code analysis rules to make sure that we're following best practices of coding as far as Oracle is concerned. So now, what we'd like to do next is to go ahead and promote this successful build to our target environments. Now, if I go back to my build project here in Jenkins, so we already went over most of the steps that we run as part of the build process here in our previous session. So we looked at how you can run your build, how you can run the invalid objects command, how you can run your code analysis. But what we're doing here additionally is we're using Octopus Deploy as a release management tool to promote our changes or to create releases and promote those releases out to target environments. So the good thing about Octopus is that it comes with the command line, so you can actually initiate the deployment of your changes through the command line of Octopus Deploy as part of your build process or any other automated process that you might have in place. So what we're doing in this case is we're saying if our build is successful and everything is valid, then let's go ahead and automatically deploy our changes to our integration environment that we've configured in Octopus Deploy. Now again, because we're utilizing the command line of our schema compare and data compare tools to configure these deployments, that means you can use any automation system out there that does accept command line or PowerShell or Linux command line in order to orchestrate your release process. So you don't have to specifically use Octopus Deploy, but that's what we're using for the purpose of our trainings today. So since we already ran this build, that means that this release already went out, got created and went out to our integration environment. So let's go ahead and take a look at Octopus Deploy and look at our project here. So the project we're deploying here is HR project. And the nice thing about utilizing a release management process in general is that you can easily version your releases and keep track of what releases have been deployed to which environment. And even more importantly, you can do one-click deployment. So you don't have to follow a lot of manual steps and manual processes in order to package up your deployments, create your releases, and deploy those out to your target environments. Instead, you can create something that is standardized and consistent, so that way you know exactly what steps you're going through when you're deploying your changes out to your environments. And as a result of that, you can standardize the process and be able to release your changes out to your target environments faster. So the most recent release that we ran was the 6027 release here that was deployed automatically to our integration environment as part of our successful build process. So let's go ahead and take a look at that release real quick. So what we're doing in this release is we've broken down our process into multiple steps. So the first step we're running here is to create what we call an Oracle release. And what this is doing in the background is that it's running the comparison engine of our schema compare and data compare tools to identify the differences between the version of the database that we built from source control to the version of the schema that already exists in the target environment that we're deploying to. So here in our database server, we have those different environments represented as different schemas. Obviously, everything in this case are running on the same server, so they're sitting all under the same database server. So these are the databases that we're deploying to as part of this automated release process. So as I said, what we're essentially doing is utilizing the command line of schema compare and data compare to run the comparison and to generate that HTML report that we saw in previous sessions when looking at schema compare command line, as well as the deployment script that schema compare generates. And we save those as artifacts here, as you can see. So let's take a look at the HTML file real quick. So as you can see here, it's showing us the objects that are different, so the context table and the get context procedures that are different. And then here it highlights the differences inside the objects. So the context table, here's how it's different. You know, we added our new column here that doesn't exist in our target environment yet. And if you look at the get context procedure, here's the differences in code between the two. So we commented out this line, and now we're running this line as part of the procedure. So it's going to be applied to our target. So we can easily keep an audit trail of exactly what differences existed from one release to another between our schema objects. And we can also see what script we actually deployed as part of that release. So if you go ahead and open up the .sql file here, we can see the deployment script for those changes. So adding the column to our context table and replacing the procedure to reflect its latest state. So the great thing about this is that you can actually have the ability to manually review your deployment before it goes out to an environment. So you can create these artifacts, you can create these reports and the SQL files, and have a DBA or whoever is in charge of doing the releases review those, and if they're happy, then they can go ahead and run the deployment against the target environment. So you can either do everything in an automated fashion, or you can have, you know, interject a process and manually review anything you'd like before it continues with the execution of those changes against your target environments. So now what I can do here is I can go ahead and say deploy this to our testing environment. And it's going to go through the exact same steps. It's going to compare our database package from our source control that we created as an artifact in our build process against our target environment schema. And it's going to find those differences that exist between the two, and it's going to give us a dedicated deployment script specifically for our testing environment. Now, with schema compare and data compare, you actually have some additional options. If you remember when we were looking at a schema compare, for instance, we talked about how you can create snapshots of your schema as part of your comparison process. And if you remember, we talked about how snapshots can be useful for either drift detection purposes or rollback purposes if you'd like to generate a rollback script of any of the changes that you're promoting to your target environments. And that same process can be done again automatically as part of your release process. So for instance, as a pre-deployment step, what I could do is I could create a snapshot and compare that snapshot to my target environment to make sure that they are identical, meaning that the target environment hasn't drifted. And if they're identical, then I would continue to do the actual deployment against that environment. But if a drift exists, I could take care of that drift first, fix it, and then move on with the deployment, or anything else that might make sense to you as additional steps within your deployment pipeline. So as you can see here, our deployment to the testing environment was also successful. It generated the exact same artifacts. So we have our HTML file, we have our update script specifically for this environment, so we can review it. And in this case, we went ahead and automatically deployed it to those target environments. But as I said, you can manually review changes as well and deploy those out once you've had a chance to review them. So now in terms of how you can implement this process, we've gone ahead and documented everything, again, under the database DevOps for Oracle documentation. So previously we looked at the worked examples, for example, for the build purposes, but now, as you can see here, we have the option for release management. So you can go ahead and take a look at some worked examples on how you can generate the deployment scripts and those reports that we looked at, and take a look at these worked examples here and look at the actual source code that you could run or use as a sample and modify wherever you need in order to implement the same process on your end. That's all from us. Hopefully you were able to see how easy it is to utilize the command line of our schema compare and data compare tools in a CI/CD process where you can check in your changes into your source control repository and be able to run builds, validate those changes, make sure you haven't broken anything, and then be able to then put those changes through a deployment pipeline going to higher environments. Thanks for watching.